Hello and welcome to The Price of Music, the show that looks at the money behind the music industry with me, Steve and Music Allies Head of Insight, Stuart Dredge. It's a listeners' questions special, so thank you to everybody who's been in touch with queries. We're always looking for ways of trying to sort of demystify the music industry, really, and its finances. So we always enjoy these episodes. Keep your questions coming. If we don't get around to yours today, then we'll get to it as soon as we can. We'll start with this from Sean Foster, who says, a couple of years ago, I was at a BC Camplight show at the Scala in London, and he said, sorry there are no CDs on the merch stall as they're too expensive. I always assumed, says Sean, that the profit on the likes of CDs at merch stalls would offer the best return to an artist. But is the margin between where an artist can buy and sell merch not as healthy as I assumed? It all begs the question from an artist's financial perspective, what is the best item that a fan can buy from their merch stall? This is a good question. I can't speak, obviously, for the artist in your particular example, but I did, Sean, get in touch with our specialist on all matters regarding pressing costs and profit margins, and he made a number of points. First, your actual CDs are quite cheap actually to make. They're much cheaper to manufacture than vinyl LPs, but the profit margin is a lot smaller. So you can press 2,500 CDs at the right place. You can press 2,500 CDs for £2,500. So it's just £1 a unit. But that's if you're doing it yourself. If you're signed to a label, they will press the CDs for you for £1, but they'll sell them to the artist for something like £7. The £6 difference going to cover costs of recording, shipping, mechanical royalties, all sorts of things come out of that £6. So you have the CDs for £7, and then you can sell them for £12 on a merch stall, Stuart, something like that. 12. I think 12 is around top level. Would you say for a CD on a merch stand?
I'd say so, yeah. Unless you're doing the lovely packaging type stuff, in which case you can sell it for more. But again, that means the cost goes up, doesn't it?
Yeah. So if you sell it for 12, you got it for 7. That's a £5 profit. But if you were selling vinyl, which that costs about, I think, £5 a unit. If you do the same run of 2,500 copies, £5 to press the vinyl album. The label then sells you, if you're with a label, sells that vinyl album to you for £15. But if it will sit on the merch stand, that will go for around, I guess, £25, in which case your profit on a vinyl album would be £10 as opposed to £5 for a CD. So vinyl is a bigger initial outlay. It also comes with more risks of being damaged en route to you. We have reports all the time of vinyl stock being damaged in transit. But it is more profitable, obviously, particularly if you sell a lot of them, which is another point here, Sean. You have to, as an artist, you have to work out which formats your audience is going to be interested in. Will they be interested in CDs? Because according to, at least anecdotal evidence at the moment, CDs are mostly popular amongst the older music buyers, less so amongst the younger audience. And also, this was interesting. He said, if you stock both, if you have a vinyl album and a CD on your merch stand, then the chances are that someone will buy the cheaper option, which is the CD, rather than the more profitable option, which is your vinyl. So it could be in an artist's best interest not to sell CDs if you want to maximise profit. But I mean, there are lots of aspects of this to consider, and especially if you're a relatively new, or you're a cash light artist, shall we say, if you're strapped for money, then CDs are back in play, aren't they? Because, as I say, they're very cheap and they're relatively risk-free, with the additional bonus that you can put one in your pocket of your jacket.
Yeah. And there is a basic point here, which is that buying from an artist merch store is one of the best places to buy because you're buying as directly as possible.
Yeah.
So the margin that might be taken on that vinyl and CD through a retailer. So if you're buying from the merch store, that's a good decision, I think, in terms of the artist's economics.
Yeah. So it depends really on at what stage you're at in your career and the size of audiences that you're playing to, how many people are at the gig. And as I say, whether you're signed to a label or you've got it alone. But vinyl and T-shirts is the answer. I finally got round to it. Sean, in answer to you, which is the best thing to buy to help your favourite artists? Vinyl and T-shirts, they're the merch items which will make the artist the most money, especially T-shirts, which you can manufacture in smaller quantities. And I mean, depending on how many you're lugging around, they're probably lighter on your back as well. The only thing I will add to that is do order the right size shirts for your audience, but that's another story for another
Oh,
day. I can tell you that from personal experience, having been on tour with T-shirt merch. Make sure you've sized up your crowd.
have I talked about the Pixies gig before? I think I saw them on, when they did their first reunion tour and they played Brixton, and oh my god, the scrum of men of a certain age and girth to get brand new Pixies t-shirts XXL to replace the kind of medium they'd squeeze into for the night
Yeah.
from the old days. Like, yeah, if your audience has aged, their waistlines may have increased, so bear that in mind.
Well, I hope that answers your question, Sean. Anyway, I mean, I've got a lot more detail on cost breakdowns around pressing CDs and vinyl and shipping it. And I mean, don't forget, we should also mention, obviously, don't forget some venues will charge artists for just setting up a merch table, or they'll take a percentage of sales as well. But I think that's something we might come back to another time. But thank you very much, Sean. And as I say, get back in touch if you require more depth. Now, question from Patrick Benasiglio. Here's something I've been wondering for years, says Patrick. Why do commercial radio stations such as Radio X or XS Manchester always play the same old songs from bands or singers? Examples include New Order, True Faith, Blur, Country House, James, Sit Down, and The Charlatans, the only one I know. My theory is that it's cheaper to keep playing a small set of songs and that stations think listeners only want the hits as defined by them. Is this just laziness on the radio station's part? And do DJs not know that these bands have kept releasing great albums with great songs far beyond 1998? Well, the answer to that, well, there's several parts to this, Patrick, some of which are editorial decisions. But even then, at the core of the answers, there is a financial consideration for these stations as to what they play, but it's possibly not for the reason you think. But let's take Radio X, shall we, as an example. And your questions one by one. So, is it cheaper playing a small set of songs? No, it isn't. Every song you play, you pay the same amount for, I believe, whether it's an old 80s hit or it's the new tune from Blossoms. There's no economy of scale, if you like. If you play the same record a lot, you still pay the same rate every single time it's played. What you do have to think about, though, is the mindset of the radio stations, because if you think about it, every radio station wants as many listeners as possible, but unlike, say, the BBC's income stays the same through, of course, what it gets from the license fee. And whether listening figures go up or down, the BBC gets the same amount of money. But commercial radio stations who rely on advertising income and sponsorship, they will make more money the more listeners they have, because they can charge more for advertising on their stations. And then, obviously, conversely, if listenership goes down, they probably have to think about reducing their ad rates, and hence they get less money. So take Radio X. Firstly, the station has to identify and build its target demographic. And I mean, I'm not inside the global building, so I can't tell you what exactly that is for Radio X. But I guess it's, what would you say, predominantly male? I mean, quite a broad age range, but it probably peaks around 30s, definitely
Yeah, male
40s.
30s, 40s. Yeah.
Yeah, and upwards. So that's the audience. Once you've worked out who your audience is, and you want to build on that audience, then you work out what you think this audience is going to like. So in a way, you were right when you say, do they define the music that they think the audience will want? Yes, they very much do. They've probably even done some research into the sort of tracks that listeners who currently listen like. And so it's going to be tracks which were big when they were younger, and a lot of big anthems that they enjoy, because, and this is where it comes back to money again, here's the risk. The risk for a commercial station is if you play, say, maybe a slightly unpopular or at least unfamiliar old record, or even an unrecognisable new record, then there is a chance that listeners will turn off because either they don't know what it is or they don't like it. But every time you do that, that's a gamble. And across the network, if you end up making that gamble a lot, you end up with what I call these risk points where you might lose listeners. And if you do this a lot, you end up potentially with listeners turning away. And obviously these days, you can go away and play your favourite records on a streaming service instead. And if your listening figures go down, your profits go down. So in this environment, that's why radio stations always turn to big, well-known artists and very familiar tunes. That makes sense so far, does it?
It does, yeah. It's why when I go in for lunch and Marianne Hobbs is on Six Music playing something that makes my teeth shake, and you realise that is one of the differences when you don't have those pressures. You don't have the pressure like, if I play this, people will go, "What is this noise?" and they'll go away somewhere else.
Yeah,
But
that's
yeah,
it. We sorry, go on.
Well, I think there's like I mean, I'm fascinated. This is where you've got the experience here. I'm just fascinated by that science of what makes people turn off and not. Like the whole idea of how can you drop in a new track and how many old tracks did you play? That there's quite a well developed sense, art and science, isn't there, of radio? Of understanding.
Even John Peel once said to me when we were talking about building radio shows, that he said you play one record that you know the audience will like, one record that you think they might like, and then one record that you don't give a damn whether they like it or not, and then you just go round and round through the hour doing those records in that hat trick of one for you, one maybe for you, one for me, and then onwards you go from there. But I think commercial stations probably look at it in a slightly different way. But it's the familiarity which a lot of people enjoy. There was always this joke. I mean, this is years ago when I was at Radio 1, but there always used to be this joke around Radio 1. I might get into trouble for saying this, but I mean, it was a while ago, so solid. That you knew the listening figures were down because obviously radio stations, although the RAJARs, which is the listening figures, the official listening figures, are announced 4 times a year. In between that, radio stations have, I guess, the equivalent of midweeks. So they get an indication from the RAJAR people that, this is where your figures are. And these days you can also tell from, the number of people who are streaming your radio shows. But so vaguely whether it's a good quarter or a bad quarter. And we always knew it was a bad quarter when the stereophonics cropped up in every show, because it was a big familiar tune. And that was when the alarm bells started ringing, because the music team were going off and finding guaranteed hits for the audience, songs they knew the audience would like, so, and to prop up the figures. So soon as stereophonics, oh my goodness, how far are we down?
Oh God! But do you know the thing that this made me think of is how the definition of greatest hits radio has changed? Because from when I was younger, greatest hits radio was my parents' generation. So it was stuff from the 60s and the 70s. And I think a lot of those artists, maybe they were still touring in some form with some original members, but they weren't really making new music as such. So it was greatest hits. Whereas now I think the reason this question came in is greatest hits now is now Britpop, isn't it? And it's even more, it's like in the early 90s is now. And a lot of those bands are. The Charlatans still make music. Blur's last album was critically acclaimed. So we are having this thing where those stations are choosing to play those artists, but not their new stuff. And it's because the new stuff isn't going to be familiar in the same way. But in the past, greatest hits radio didn't have to worry about that because, I don't know, the Drifters weren't making new music.
Yeah.
You could play the old hits only and no one cared.
I mean, and the thing is, just to come back to the initial point, Patrick, and using our example of Radio X, this formula of playing a smaller selection of familiar songs tailored specifically to the core of its audience does seem to be working, because I looked up their current listening figures, and I mean Radio X's figures have been going up slowly for quite a while now. So whatever it is, whatever you think of the station, it's obviously doing pretty well, because they have just recorded their record ever figures. Radio X currently reaches 2.3 million listeners, which is the first time they've hit that figure. So don't expect the daytime playlist to change very much anytime soon. But thank you very much, Patrick. Question from Bob Bright. Do bands still have to pay to get a decent support slot on a tour? So, well, I mean, again, this is a good question. I mean, this is something which we have alluded to in past programs. On the whole, and I'm still waiting back for a couple of emails from people who I asked about this, but on the whole, I don't think so. I mean, as I say, I'm going to try and check with some more of my agent promoter friends. But if it does still happen, Bob, then I think it's much higher up the live ladder than the obviously grassroots gigs or even medium-sized venues. Whereas back in the day, as we've said before, I mean, it was common practice back in the 90s when there was a bit more money flying around the industry, and record labels were far less they were less reticent about reaching into their pockets to help out their bands to go out on tour. So back then, I mean, in the 90s, it wasn't uncommon for bands to be given money by the label, which is called tour support, to help them out going around showcasing their wares in front of potential fans. But yes, there were a lot of groups as well who, and the phrase is, by the way, Bob, buying on. It's a tour buy-on. That's how it's described, or was described. And this is where, as you're saying, this is where the support band would pay the headline band some money to go out on tour. So effectively, they were buying a chance to be seen by an audience, which I'm not always sure. I mean, it's successful in some instances, but it also occasionally will fail, because although you get put in front of an audience, you've bought the stage, it doesn't necessarily mean that the audience will like you or even see you. I mean, half of them might be in the bar still, depending on what time you're on. And I think you can probably tell, you probably have from gigs that you've seen in the past, you can tell when there's an awkward bill where you're thinking, well, either the promoter's just got this completely wrong, or that support band, and I'm thinking back to the noughties and the 90s here, that band does not fit with the headliner. Something's awry here.
It's funny because this is where the shutters come down from my eyes. Because when I was young and going to loads of concerts, I'd always assume that it was like the band had picked the support acts because they liked them. And it was camaraderie. Like I remember seeing, talking of mismatches, I remember seeing mismatches that were definitely the band choosing. So I remember seeing the Cardiac supported Blur at Mile End and went down like a jug of cold sick. But when you listen to them now, you're like, I can totally hear why Blur picked them to support them. They were a strong influence. Yeah. And I saw Minty support Pulp, which can you imagine the whole of UEA watching Pulp, lots of Britpop kids, fresh face, and then Minty come on and do Performance Art Being Born. So I think
you might have to explain Minty for people who weren't around in the 90s.
I think people should Google Minty and then go on YouTube, really. But
all right.
But that I always assumed it was like that, like the band had picked the people to support them because they had a kinship or culture. So yeah, I was quite sad to learn about buying on. That it kind of made me maybe lost my innocence in the music industry.
But certainly, as I say, I mean, the stories around the 90s, maybe even into the noughties, and it happened quite a lot. And prices would range from £3,000 upwards, £3 grand, £5 grand or more. But as I say, I mean, although it wasn't uncommon in the past, I haven't come across it a lot in my world of late. It doesn't mean, though, that it isn't still happening. In fact, one agent who I spoke to, who we shall call the secret agent, they said, and I quote, "I suspect buy-ons do still exist, but they are not as commonplace as they used to be. I would guess that it can still happen, probably more with pop acts when labels are wanting to boost, their next big thing to a specific audience." He also added, sometimes these days, the buy-on gets disguised under this line, and I quote, "There is a production contribution required to join this tour." Wow, what a
You're
bit of
paying for the
spin.
outfit.
Yeah,
But
what
I
a
mean,
bit of spin that is, though. I mean, essentially, what you want us to buy onto the tour? That's what you mean.
you want us to pay for your outfit change. But I think the other thing you see is you'll see, like you say, management companies will have someone new and someone established and putting the new person on the tour. So it's less of a buy on. It's more of a we're gonna use our established act to leverage. Yeah.
Absolutely, it's favours amongst agents, or it's using your big act to promote your smaller act. Yeah, that is very common, obviously, because why wouldn't you? If you got the stage and the band seems to fit, then that's
Do
that.
you remember?
happens a
Do you remember
lot.
that? Do you remember that era when the announcement in the press would be brand new boy band X are being managed by member of established boy band Y? So Bob from Boyzone is managing, this new band. And I'd be like, oh, I didn't know. And of course, it wasn't that. It was just they were management, or label mates. And they were kind of, that was the way to get them in the press. So that, those days are still here, maybe.
I must have missed Bob from Boyzone. When did Bob from Boyzone leave? Was there a
Oh,
Bob in Boyzone?
he was an
Bob,
OG member,
Bob Boyzone.
Only true stands remember him.
There you go. Anyway, that's so as far as we know, and if I find out any more, Bob will come back to this question in future programs. That will do it for this one, though. We'll have another listeners' questions show very shortly for you. So if you'd like a question answered, drop us a line. It's thepriceofmusicpodcast at gmail.com. Thank you very much for listening. Obviously, if you enjoyed the show, and we hope you have, do subscribe in your podcast app and give us a review and a rating. And if you'd like to support the show, and can we thank everyone who's signed up to our Patreon page already, but you can become a Price of Music fan too, or indeed a super fan for as little as £2 a month. Patreon.com/thepriceofmusic to find out more. Thanks again, everybody. Cheerio.
When you drive a vehicle so reliable it's backed by a 10-year, 100,000-mile limited warranty, you stop thinking about what you can't do and start doing what you never thought possible. Visit your local Kia dealer today to see what you're capable of in a vehicle that inspires confidence around every corner. Kia, movement that inspires.
Call 800-333-4KIA for details. Always drive safely. Limited inventory available. Warranties include 10-year 100,000-mile powertrain and 5-year 60,000-mile basic. Warranties are limited. See retailer for details.